Bibliophiles of the internet. I'm sure you've heard of Hot Girl Summer, but as your friendly neighborhood trans mask, I submit to you instead the idea of Not Girl Summer. And I have some books that I think you can read and enjoy for Not Girl Summer or any other time of the year you would like. First of all, before anyone jumps down my throat, it is still technically summer here in the Northern Hemisphere until almost the end of September. Should I have made this list a little bit earlier? Maybe, but I'm still technically not late. Also, just to get this out of the way, this is not intended to be a definitive list, so please do not treat it as such. My requirements for Not Girl Summer reads are pretty expansive. It's not as simple as books that are not about girls, but rather books that are specifically about trans guys, trans masks, NBs who do not identify as women or femme, and really trans masks of any flavor or persuasion. I think you get the idea, and I'm going to start by rapid firing through some titles that I think people expect to be on this list. These are pretty popular or well-known books. I don't need to talk about them at great length. I'm sure you are familiar with them, especially if you've spent really any amount of time with me here in this space. This one should go without saying, but obviously we have Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, a queer Latina YA paranormal mystery about a trans brujo named Yadriel who wants to prove to his traditional family that he can in fact practice brujo magic. So he tries to summon the spirit of his recently deceased cousin to find out the truth of what happened to him, but instead accidentally summons a classmate named Julian Diaz. Aidan also has the Sunbearer duology, which starts with the Sunbearer trials. It's basically like if the Hunger Games met Percy Jackson, but with a pantheon of Mexican gods instead of Greek. It's set in this fantasy world where every 10 years, I think, they have to replenish the power of the sun with a sacrifice of a semidios, and there is a series of trials to determine who will become the sacrifice. And then of course we have pretty much the entire bibliography of Andrew Joseph White, starting with Hell Followed With Us. This is set in a bleak dystopian future where a young trans autistic boy has escaped from the fundamentalist cult that has not only destroyed the world, but also infected him with a virus that might turn him into a deadly bioweapon. The Spirit Bears Its Teeth is a gothic horror story set in Victorian London where a trans autistic boy named Silas is bound to become a speaker, one who communes with spirits. He runs away from his family, attempting to escape an arranged marriage, but is ultimately captured and diagnosed with veil sickness and sent away to a horrific sanatorium for treatment. Compound Fracture is a queer Appalachian thriller about a trans autistic teen named Miles who's caught in the middle of a violent generational blood feud, and when he finds some damning evidence that might just turn the tides of the feud, his enemies find out about it and things quickly turn from bad to worse. I haven't read it, so I can't personally recommend it yet, but Andrew also has his adult horror debut, You Weren't Meant to Be Human, coming out fairly soon, which would also comfortably fit on this list. Then of course we have the vast majority of H.E. Edgman's work, namely the Witch King duology, which is a YA fantasy series about a trans witch who lost control of his magic as a child and fled from the Fae Kingdom to the human world. But years later, after he's grown up and transitioned, his betrothed, the Fae Prince, hunts him down in the human world and wants to make good on their engagement. There's also the Ouroboros duology, which begins with Godly Heathens and is about a non-binary Seminole teenager named Jem who's always been haunted by visions of magic and violence, and they eventually find out that they might be a reincarnated god from another world. F.T. Lukens, another author I love, also has a couple of books that would comfortably fit on this list, namely Spellbound, which is a YA paranormal romance about two rival apprentice sorcerers whose mentors end up getting arrested when an illegal magic detecting device that one of the apprentices made is discovered, and so they have to team up to save their mentors and protect their magic. Otherworldly is their other YA paranormal romance with an NB lead. It's about a teenager named Ellery who doesn't believe in magic and yet is living in a small town that has been stuck in a non-stop winter for 5 years straight. One day they literally run into a familiar from the other world named Nox, and they strike a deal where Ellery will help Nox experience all the wonders of the human world if Nox in turn helps to figure out how they can break the town's curse. Now that what I think are the obvious choices have been shared for posterity, let's talk about some lesser known trans mask stories that I think deserve some more love, starting with Simplicity by Maddie Lubchansky. This is a recent release. It's an adult graphic novel that blends horror and dystopia. It's set in the distant future where most of the states in the US have broken off into independently secured territories, but there's a sort of socialist community that still lives off the land in the Catskills. Our main character is a trans man who's been assigned to complete an anthropological survey of this community for a history museum, but when he goes out there, weird shit starts happening. I read this one recently. It's so weird but so good, and it has a lot to say about what it means to be a responsible citizen of this earth, the responsibility that we have to each other and to ourselves, and how nothing can ever be changed unless we face it first. Speaking speaking of recent releases, I enthusiastically encourage you to pick up the Build a Boyfriend Project, which is Mason Deaver's adult romance debut. It's about a trans journalist named Eli who's basically working a dead-end job as an assistant, but after going on a truly horrific first date and venting about it in the office, his boss encourages him to keep seeing this guy, teach him how to be a better boyfriend, and if he can somehow turn that into an article, he might get promoted to staff writer, which is everything he wants. I read my arc of this book way back in December, and I've been so excited for it to come out ever since because it's truly something special. It's a really beautiful and endearing story about second chances, not just in terms of romance, but also with two main characters who are getting to have a second chance at life in so many ways. I also have to give a ringing endorsement for The Lilac People by Milo Todd, which is set in both pre- and post-war Berlin in the 1930s and 40s. The story follows a young trans man named Bertie who has to remain in hiding with both his girlfriend and a stranger who turns out to be a trans Holocaust survivor even after the Allies swoop in to run off the Nazis because being transgender was still considered a crime and a death sentence. So basically their only hope is to somehow flee their home in the countryside and make their way, ironically, to the States. I've said this before, but what I really love about this story is that it excavates lesser-known moments of trans history and shows how our trans lineage extends back so much farther than we're taught to believe. But it's also just a really beautiful testament to how history is not just something that is recorded, but something that is lived and something that we actually carry with us on our bodies. Now, I know Paige Power's most recent book, And They Were Roommates, has been pretty successful and pretty widely talked about, so I'll give that a quick nod, but I think people should also check out his debut, which is The Borrow a Boyfriend Club. This book is like hugely and obviously inspired by the chaos that is Ouran High School Host Club. It is a YA rom-com about a trans boy named Noah who is kind of starting over at a new school, and he has this wild idea that he's going to prove his gender by joining the most masked, manliest club he can find on campus. So he signs up for what he thinks is the Italian club, but actually turns out to be a secret club called the Borrow a Boyfriend Club, which is basically an underground dating service where guys are rented out for dates and special events. Paige has a very specific kind of style to his rom-coms. It's deeply unserious, it's borderline shitposty, it's over the top in the most delightful, satirical way. It's chaotic, but it's endearing, and this debut has a really fun fake dating romance. Speaking of romance, I obviously recommend A Gentleman's Gentleman by TJ Alexander. It's a Regency romance about a young trans man named Lord Christopher who prefers to keep his privacy and live far away from the prying eyes and ears of the Ton so that he can live as himself in peace. But one day he receives word from his lawyers that his late father's will stipulates that he must find himself a bride before the end of the season if he wants to retain control over the family fortune and estate. Even though he keeps very little staff, he ends up hiring a new valet to keep up appearances as an eligible single man, and ends up falling for that valet instead. I had such a great time listening to this one. The fact of the matter is that there isn't much trans rep in historical romance, period, much less Regency romance, so it's really great to see all of those familiar tropes and trappings of the genre through a distinctly trans lens. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about The Palace of Eros by Quero de Robertes. This is a queer Greek myth retelling of the story of Psyche and Eros, where Psyche is the non-binary offspring of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Basically, Psyche is an incredibly beautiful mortal woman who's captured the attention of suitors far and wide, which makes Aphrodite incredibly jealous, and so she schemes to convince Psyche's family to leave her for dead. But before Psyche is killed, Eros swoops in to save her and whisks her away to their majestic palace. This is a really wonderful book. It is deeply romantic, but it's also exploring a lot about self-love and what it means to negotiate authentic self-expression with the necessity of your own protection and safety, especially in a world that isn't always accepting. How do we balance those things? On a very different note, I also think that a prime example of not girl summer reading would have to be The Prospects by K.T. Hoffman. This is a wildly entertaining and endearing trans rom-com. It's also a sports romance. It's about a minor league baseball player named Gene who is the first openly trans professional baseball player, but the career he's very carefully built up for himself gets turned upside down when his rival and former teammate Luis gets traded to the same team. The phrase "feel good" was invented for stories like this. I was smiling from ear to ear pretty much the entire way through this book, and I laughed out loud so many times. This is definitely one of those stories that doesn't take itself too seriously, but at the same time is so incredibly thoughtful, heartfelt, and just triumphant. For those of you who love the summer scaries, I do have to give a quick shout out to the Sworn Soldier series by T. Kingfisher, which starts with What Moves the Dead. The first novella in this series is a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher and follows our main character, Alex Easton, who is a non-binary retired soldier. Alex receives word that an old childhood friend has become sick with a mysterious illness, so Ka journeys to Confriend's crumbling manor, and there Alex discovers a nightmare of fungal growths, possessed wildlife, and a dark, pulsing lake. Again, if you like horror and mystery and unsettling atmosphere, this series is perfect for all of those things. There are currently 2 installments out, both exploring 2 very different subgenres of horror, and if you like those, the 3rd book should actually be coming out fairly soon. Another one of my absolute favorite trans books that fits this bill perfectly is Beating Heart Baby by Leo Min. This is a queer YA coming-of-age story about a teenager named Santi who's starting over at a new school, and he joins the marching band where everyone seems pretty nice and glad to have him, except for an arrogant musical prodigy, a trans boy named Suwa, who tells Santi that he does not have what it takes. This is one of those books I always recommend to people who want to feel something and to feel it deeply in their soul, who read because they want to be reminded of what it means to truly be alive. I think the way that Leo Min captures love and life and change in this book is both exhilarating and impossibly tender all at once. It's truly something special that I don't think anyone should miss. Speaking of trans boys, I have to show some love for Self-Made Boys by A.M. Macklemore, which is a Great Gatsby YA remix where both Gatsby and Nick are not only gay and canonically in love, but also trans. I absolutely love what A.M. Macklemore is able to do with this remix. They're able to make so many nods to the source material and maintain those key moments, themes, and motifs that everyone has come to associate with The Great Gatsby, but also make the story their own and transform it into something completely new and fresh. Possibly my most underrated addition to this list is A Million Quiet Revolutions by Robin Gao. This is a queer YA story written in verse about 2 trans boys who fall in love and also come to their transness around the same time. And when one of them has to move away, they begin sending letters to each other to stay in touch. They also discover a story about these 2 American Revolutionary soldiers who were believed to be trans and in love, and they each adopt one of the soldiers' names as a way of writing themselves into history and holding on to their transness. I think this is such a beautiful story that deserves so much more love. I love the way these characters are interfacing with history throughout the story, but it's also really powerful to see them not only discovering queer history and queering history in a way, but also making queer history of their own by taking these forgotten names and giving them literal new life. We also have Meet Cute Diary by Emery Lee, which is about a disaster trans boy named Noah who likes to think that he's an expert on romance, which is why he runs this super popular blog called Meet Cute Diary that documents trans happily ever after stories. The only problem is that all of these stories are fake. When people online start figuring this out, he tries to convince everyone that the stories are real, and he decides the best way to do that is to find someone to fake date him so they can fabricate some proof. I like to say that this book is every bit as lighthearted as it is absolutely disastrous. Noah is a truly destructive character who has a lot of mistakes to make before he can get himself to even a semi-better place, but I appreciate the story for giving him that space to be messy and to make those mistakes. And I think the story really touches on the double-edged sword that is trans representation, especially when it comes to the demands of online content and public visibility that can be empowering on one hand, but can also be very dangerous. Switching gears to middle grade, I always recommend Obi is Man Enough by Skylar Balar, which is about a young trans athlete named Obi who swims competitively. And when he medically transitions, he also has to transition from the girls swim team to the boys swim team, which presents its own complications. I think this is such a special story, not only because it very closely mirrors Skylar's own experiences as a trans swimmer himself, so you can tell it comes from a very real place, but it's also an incredibly foundational story that shows what true allyship, love, and support should look like. Another trans-masc middle grade story that I recommend is Too Bright to See by Kyle Lukoff. This is both a coming-of-age story and a bit of a ghost story following a young trans kid who calls themselves Bug, and it's set during the summer before middle school where all of Bug's friends are concerned with wearing girly clothes, putting on makeup, and learning how to flirt with cute boys. Bug wants nothing to do with any of those things, and even if they did, they would have much bigger problems to worry about because it seems like a ghost might be haunting their house. This is one of my favorite coming-of-age stories because it uses the concept of being haunted in a way that really speaks to the trans experience of being haunted by a vision of yourself or a vision of your future that you may or may not ever get to inhabit. The specter of possibility, so to speak, is a very real thing that often haunts trans people of any persuasion, and I think this story explores that metaphorical disconnect in a really wonderful way. Going back to adult fiction, an incredibly underrated trans-masc book is Jordy Rosenberg's Confessions of the Fox. This story is told across 2 timelines, editions, one in present day and one in 18th century London. It's about a heartbroken scholar who discovers a long-lost manuscript revealing that two of London's most notorious thieves and jailbreakers were actually queer lovers, and that one of them was also trans. And as the scholar is diving deeper into this manuscript and trying to authenticate it, he begins to be hunted by people who would also very much like this manuscript for themselves. This story is such a unique blend of queer historical fiction, metafiction, and academia. The manuscript the main character finds is called Confessions of the Fox, so as the reader, you're actually reading the manuscript alongside the main character and also reading his notes and annotations. And if that wasn't wild enough, every citation refers to a historical resource that actually exists in real life, so it makes for a deeply fascinating experience. If you want a more straightforward but still powerful story, I would recommend The 30 Names of Night by Zain Jokadar. This story is about a young closeted Syrian-American trans man who's searching for a new name for himself, and one day he discovers the journal of a Syrian artist who spent her life painting incredibly rare birds. And her journal actually proves that both the main character's mother and this artist encountered the same rare bird before they passed away. There's so much more to this story than I can share in just a few sentences, but this is such a remarkable book. At its heart, it's an intimate character study that takes a very thoughtful look at the grieving process, not only as the main character grieves the loss of their mom, but also grieves a loss of themselves and the future they thought they might occupy in many ways. And of course, it's also a story that celebrates the power of names, not only naming ourselves, but also naming our experiences, our desires, our feelings, the things that we're missing in life, so that we might then have the strength to address those things. Another truly sensational transmasc story that I will never hesitate to recommend is The Gods of Tango by Guerrero de Robertes. This is a Latin historical fiction story about a trans man named Dante who's still presenting as a young woman when the story begins, which is when his family is sending him back to their homeland of Argentina in order to meet the man that he's been arranged to marry. But when he arrives in Argentina, he learns that his fiancée has been killed. So now he's essentially stranded. He doesn't speak the language, he has no money, but he does have a strong desire to make a living off of music. And because the only people who can become professional tangueros at this time are men, he teaches himself how to play tango, begins presenting as a man, and sets his sight on the music scene of Buenos Aires. I just love what this story has to say about how impossible it can feel to try and parse the question of who you are and who you might become, and how sometimes the only way you can do that is to find your limitations and figure out what it is that you can't be and what you are not. This is a truly incredible story that I cannot recommend enough. Again, this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but lastly for today, I could not make this list without including another all-time favorite book, which is Peter Darling by S.A. Chance. Honestly, this is kind of a legendary pool, and if you haven't read it yet, you absolutely need to fix that. This is a trans fairy tale reimagining of your classic Peter Pan story, but it imagines that Peter once was Wendy Darling in the human world before he came to Neverland and became his true self. When the story begins, he does return to the human world and revert to living as Wendy for a time, but then he eventually returns back to Neverland and he finds that a lot has changed. This was one of the first transmasc books I ever read, and it still has such a special place in my heart to this day. It's a whimsical, lovely, adventurous take on Neverland and is able to build out that classic fantasy world in new and surprising ways. The characters are deeply fascinating and complex. There's a great Achillean romance between an age-appropriate Peter and Captain Hook that's so incredibly enticing, and as I always say, if you're looking for an entryway into S.A. Chance work, as you should be, you can't do much better than this. Again, to be very clear, this is not even every single transmasc book that I've read, much less every single one that possibly exists. But again, if you're looking for something to read for the Not Girl Summer season, I think this is a pretty solid starter pack. Of course, if you have any recommendations for Not Girl Summer reading, feel free to share those with the class down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.